At 19, she was forced to marry the cold Amish man. The townsfolk whispered that her life was over, that his house was colder than the valley snow, and his heart colder still. But when she stepped inside that lonely cabin, what he did next changed everything. Under the sound of a church bell and the crackle of a frozen fire, a frightened young bride faces a man who hasn't spoken to God since his wife and child died. He promises not to touch her, only to protect her. Yet when railroad men arrive claiming the land beneath their feet, a buried secret is uncovered. The deed belongs to her. Now faith, land, and love collide beneath a storm no prayer can stop, as fire lights the horizon and the past rises from the grave. Will mercy thaw the coldest man in Colorado, or will pride bury them both beneath the snow? Tell me in the comments where you're watching from right now, and if this story speaks to you, make sure you hit subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Ruth knelt on the rough wooden floor of her uncle's home, her knees aching as she scrubbed at the stubborn stains. The cold water numbed her fingers, but she kept working, finding comfort in the familiar motion. Outside, the winter wind whistled through the streets of Alamosa, carrying the sharp bite of mountain snow. "Ruth," her Uncle Samuel's voice made her pause. She looked up to find him standing in the doorway, his face drawn with worry lines she hadn't noticed before. "Come sit. We must talk." Wiping her hands on her apron, Ruth rose and followed him to the kitchen table. The kerosene lamp cast long shadows across his troubled features as he settled into his chair. "Times are hard," he began, not meeting her eyes. "The drought has left us owing more than we can pay." His fingers drummed against the wooden tabletop. "There's a farmer, an Amish man named Ephraim Stoll, who holds our debt. He's offered a way to settle it." Ruth's heart quickened. She had heard whispers about the widow Stoll, whose ranch lay at the valley's edge. Some called him the cold Amish man, though none spoke it to his face. "He'll forgive what we owe," Samuel continued, his voice strained, "if you'll consent to be his wife." The words fell like stones in the quiet kitchen. Ruth's hands twisted in her lap as understanding dawned. "Uncle Samuel, The marriage will take place this week," he cut in, still avoiding her gaze. "It's God's provision, child. Stoll is a man of means, and his faith is strong. You'll want for nothing." Tears pricked at Ruth's eyes, but she blinked them back. Since her parents' death, she had learned to accept what came with grace. "Yes, Uncle," she whispered. The days passed in a blur of preparation. Before Ruth could truly grasp what was happening, she found herself in a wagon heading toward her new life. The morning air was sharp with frost, and snow dusted the San Luis Valley like sugar on bread. Her small trunk of belongings rattled behind her with each bump in the rutted road. The one-room church stood stark against the winter sky. Inside, only the elders waited, their faces solemn as stone. And there was Ephraim Stoll himself, tall and broad-shouldered, his beard neat, his eyes cast downward. Ruth's steps faltered as she approached, but she forced herself forward. The ceremony was brief, the words nearly lost in the moan of the wind outside. Ruth's voice shook as she made her vows, while Ephraim's responses came steady and clear. Not once did he look directly at her. As twilight settled over the valley, they reached his cabin. Ruth's new home. The structure was solid and well-maintained, with smoke rising straight from the chimney into the darkening sky. Inside, warmth from the cooking hearth wrapped around her like a blanket, but did little to ease her trembling. Ephraim moved about the cabin with purpose, hanging his coat, stoking the fire. When he finally turned to her, Ruth braced herself, expecting. She wasn't sure what. but his expression held no demand, no threat. "You'll be safe here," he said quietly, his voice lower than it had been during their vows. "I give you my word. I won't touch you until your heart permits it." He paused, then added, "There's a small room prepared for you. Through that door." Ruth stood frozen, struggling to reconcile this gentle consideration with the cold man she'd been warned about. "Thank you," she managed to whisper. Something flickered in Ephraim's eyes, pain, perhaps, or memory, before his gaze dropped again. "You must be tired. Rest now. We'll speak more tomorrow." As Ruth closed the door to her room, she pressed a hand to her racing heart. The space was simple but comfortable, with a narrow bed and a small window looking out over the snow-covered fields. A single candle burned on the bedside table, and someone, Ephraim, had placed a fresh quilt on the bed. This small kindness, unexpected as the morning dew, brought tears to her eyes. She had prepared herself for harshness, for demands, for a marriage of cold duty. Instead, she found herself facing something far more complex. A man whose gruff exterior seemed to hide depths of gentleness she hadn't anticipated. As she changed into her nightclothes, Ruth could hear Ephraim moving about in the main room, his footsteps measured and quiet. The sound was oddly comforting, like the steady tick of a clock marking time's passage. Perhaps, she thought as she slipped beneath the quilt, this forced marriage might hold more hope than she'd dared imagine. Sleep came slowly that night, but when it did, Ruth's dreams were touched with the first fragile blooms of trust, like crocuses pushing through winter snow. Ruth woke before sunrise, the unfamiliar creaks of the cabin settling around her. Through her small window, the sky held only the faintest hint of dawn. She dressed quickly in the cold, her fingers trembling as she pinned her prayer covering in place. The main room was dark and still when she emerged. Ruth found the tinderbox exactly where she expected. Everything in Ephraim's home had its proper place. She knelt by the hearth, working quietly to bring warmth back to the ashes. As light spread through the cabin, its perfect order became clear. Every surface gleamed, every item stood arranged with military precision, yet something vital was missing. No photographs adorned the walls, no scattered pieces of daily life softened the corners. Only a stark wall clock broke the silence with its steady ticking. Ruth found herself counting the seconds between beats, trying to fill the hollow quiet with something, anything. The back door creaked, and Ephraim's tall form passed like a shadow. He paused only long enough to take his heavy coat from its peg. "I tend the stock at dawn," he said, his voice low. "Breakfast at 6. Then he was gone, leaving Ruth alone in the immaculate emptiness. She spent the morning learning her new domain. The kitchen cupboards were organized with careful precision. Flour, sugar, and salt in matching ceramic crocks. Dishes stacked by size. Pots hung in descending order. Everything cleaned to a shine that spoke of long hours of solitary labor. Outside, Ruth traced the paths between buildings. The barn stood solid and well-maintained, its red paint fresh despite the harsh weather. A smokehouse squatted nearby, and beyond that, a deep well with a new rope. Every structure showed the same attention to detail she'd seen inside. This was a place where work never ceased, where idle moments were enemies to be conquered. Her feet carried her past a small orchard, bare branches reaching toward the gray sky. Behind it, she found what she'd both dreaded and needed to see: 2 grave markers, simple wooden crosses weathered by sun and storm. No names were carved there, but Ruth knew who lay beneath. The first Mrs. Stoll, and the child she'd borne. Standing before them, Ruth felt the weight of their absence in every corner of the homestead. The day passed in a blur of small tasks. Ruth swept floors that didn't need sweeping, polished surfaces that already shone. As dusk approached, she prepared a simple supper of bread and stew, setting the table just as the horizon swallowed the sun. Ephraim returned as the first stars appeared. He hung his coat, washed his hands, and took his place at the table without a word. Ruth sat across from him, hands folded in her lap, waiting. His prayer was brief and mechanical, the words falling into the silence like pebbles into a deep well. When he finished, they ate without speaking. The only sounds were the scrape of spoons and the endless ticking of the wall clock. Ruth gathered her courage between spoonfuls of stew. Would you mind if I sang a hymn? Her voice sounded small in the vast quiet. Ephraim's spoon paused halfway to his mouth. For a moment, something flickered in his eyes. Pain or memory, she couldn't tell. Not yet, he said softly, then resumed eating. Later, as Ruth cleared the table, snow began falling in earnest. The wind drove white flurries against the windows, building drifts that glowed in the lamplight. In her small room, Ruth knelt beside her bed, pressing her forehead against clasped hands. Lord, she whispered, grant me courage for this path you've chosen. Help me bring light back to this dark place. She paused, listening to the wind's moan. And help him find his way back to your joy. The sound of tools from the main room drew her attention. Through the door's crack, she watched Ephraim work on a broken chair, his movements sure and practiced. His hands moved over the wood with gentle skill that belied his stern demeanor. As she turned to seek her bed, his voice stopped her. The stew was good. 3 simple words, spoken quietly, yet they hung in the air like the first notes of a forgotten song. Thank you, Ruth replied, equally soft. That night, lying beneath her quilt, Ruth finally understood. The precision that ruled this house, the silence that filled it. These weren't marks of cruelty, but shields against grief. Every spotless surface and ordered shelf was a barrier against the chaos of loss. Ephraim's coldness wasn't hatred, but a frozen river of mourning that had never thawed. The wall clock ticked in the darkness, counting out the seconds of another lonely night. But now, Ruth thought, at least there were 2 people listening to its rhythm. Perhaps that was enough for a beginning. The days melted together under a blanket of pewter clouds. Ruth found her hands growing stronger as she learned the rhythm of farm life. Each morning, she followed Ephraim to the barn, watching carefully as he demonstrated how to milk the goats. Her first attempts sent streams of milk splashing against the bucket's rim, but gradually her fingers found their way. Gentle but firm, Ephraim said, one of the few times he spoke during their morning chores. Like this. He showed her again, his large hands moving with surprising delicacy along the goat's udder. Ruth nodded, mimicking his motions until warm milk hissed steadily into her pail. The harnesses proved a greater challenge. Leatherwork required patience and strength, qualities Ruth discovered in herself as she learned to punch holes and work the awl. Ephraim would inspect her repairs each evening, running calloused fingers over her stitching. Sometimes he would nod, the closest thing to praise she'd seen from him. One gray afternoon, Ruth wrapped herself in a thick shawl and headed to the woodpile. The air smelled of snow, though the sky held its burden for now. As she gathered split logs into her arms, a voice called out from the road. "Good day to you, Mrs. Stoll." Ruth turned to find a man on horseback watching her. He sat easily in the saddle, his dark hair tied back neatly. His clothes were a mixture of Western and traditional, and his eyes held a quiet wisdom that put her at ease despite her surprise. "I'm Josiah Red Elk," he said, touching the brim of his hat. "I work as translator for the Denver and Rio Grande survey crew." His voice carried warmth and respect, with none of the coldness she'd grown used to. "How do you know my name?" Ruth asked, adjusting her grip on the wood. "News travels, even out here." Josiah's smile was gentle. "I should warn you, the railroad's been asking about water rights in this valley. They've got their eye on the stream that runs through your property." Ruth felt her chest tighten. The stream was their lifeblood, feeding both crops and stock. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because sometimes it's good to know which way the wind's blowing before the storm hits." Josiah's expression grew serious. "Your husband's got good water here. Railroad folks tend to notice such things." Ruth nodded, understanding the weight of his warning. "Thank you, Mr. Red Elk." "Josiah," he corrected kindly, "may the Creator watch over your household." With another touch of his hat, he turned his horse back toward the road. That evening, as Ephraim scraped his plate clean, Ruth gathered her courage. "A man stopped by today," she said softly. "Josiah Red Elk. He works for the railroad as a translator." Ephraim's shoulders stiffened, the fork in his hand stilled. "He said they're looking at water rights in the valley, near our stream." "The land is mine." Ephraim's voice was hard as iron. "The water, too. No one's taking what belongs to us." He set his fork down with careful precision. "You're not to speak with strangers again. It isn't safe." "He was only trying to help. I said no." The words cut through the air like a knife. But beneath the sharpness, Ruth heard something else. Fear, raw and deep. Ephraim stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. He strode to his room, leaving Ruth alone with the cooling dishes and her thoughts. Later that night, unable to sleep, Ruth crept to the kitchen for a drink of water. A sound from Ephraim's room made her pause. Through the barely open door, she saw him sitting on his bed, holding something small in his hands. It was a carved wooden horse, worn smooth by small fingers long stilled. "Lord," she heard him whisper, his voice cracking, "why did you—" The prayer died unfinished. His broad shoulders shook once, then grew still. Ruth retreated silently to her room, her heart aching. She understood now, this wasn't just about the railroad. This land held more than crops and cattle. It held memories, graves, the ghosts of happiness. For Ephraim, losing any part of it would mean losing them all over again. The next morning, Ephraim left before dawn to mend the fence line. Ruth watched him go, then turned to her chores. As she worked, a hymn rose unbidden to her lips. She sang softly at first, then with growing strength, her voice filling the spaces where silence had ruled for so long. "Let the dead bury their dead," she thought, "but let the living sing." The blizzard struck without warning, shrouding the farm in white. Ruth woke to find snow piled halfway up the kitchen window and more falling fast. In the barn, she found Ephraim kneeling beside Sarah, their oldest milking goat. The animal lay on her side, breathing heavily. "She took sick in the night," Ephraim said, his voice tight with concern. "Fever's high." Ruth touched the goat's neck, feeling the heat beneath the coarse fur. "I'll fetch water and cloths," she said, already moving toward the door. Her mother had taught her about tending sick animals, one of the many lessons she now treasured. For 2 days, the storm raged outside while they tended Sarah. Ruth kept cool compresses on the goat's neck, mixing herbs into warm water to coax her to drink. Ephraim carried fresh hay and helped turn Sarah every few hours, his large hands surprisingly gentle on the animal's weakened frame. With the paths blocked by snow, their world narrowed to the barn and house, After finishing the essential chores, Ruth found herself with time to spare. Standing by the kitchen window, watching the swirling white beyond, she began to hum softly. The melody of Rock of Ages filled the quiet kitchen. Ephraim, who had been mending a bridle at the table, went still as stone. Ruth noticed and began to stop, but he raised his hand. "That was Elizabeth's favorite," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "My wife's." Ruth's hands clutched her apron. "I'm sorry, I didn't know." "No." Ephraim set down his work. "Please don't stop." Ruth resumed the hymn, her voice soft and clear in the lamplit kitchen. After a moment, another voice joined hers, rough from disuse, but carrying the harmony with surprising strength. Ephraim's eyes were closed, his fingers moving slightly with the familiar rhythm. When the last note faded, silence settled between them like a blanket. Ruth poured 2 cups of tea, setting one before him. Steam rose in the cooling air. 2 years, Ephraim said finally, staring into his cup. 2 years since I've sung that hymn, since I've sung anything. Ruth waited, sensing he had more to say. Elizabeth loved music, always had a song for every task. Even in childbirth, she hummed to keep her strength. His fingers tightened around the cup. When the fever took her and Jacob both, I buried more than them. Buried my faith too. Couldn't see the purpose in God's plan anymore. Sometimes, Ruth said carefully, the purpose isn't for us to see, only to trust. Ephraim looked at her then, really looked at her, perhaps for the first time. You sound like Elizabeth. The storm cleared on the 3rd morning, leaving the world transformed under crystalline snow. Ruth found new energy in her steps as she moved through her tasks. She took down the faded curtains, washing and mending them with careful stitches. The smell of baking bread filled the kitchen, bringing warmth to rooms long cold. That evening, after the chores were done, Ruth sat at the kitchen table with paper and pen. Her cousin Mary in Denver had always been more sister than cousin, and Ruth's fingers flew across the page as she described her new life. The cold Amish man isn't so cold after all, she wrote, smiling slightly at the phrase. There's warmth there, buried deep like spring bulbs under snow. Today he sang for the first time in 2 years. His voice carried such sadness, but also something else, something seeking the light. She paused, considering her next words carefully. I pray that spring will soften more than just the snow. God's grace moves slowly sometimes, like ice melting on a river, but it moves all the same. Ruth looked up from her letter to find Ephraim in the doorway, watching her with an unreadable expression. He carried 2 steaming cups of tea. Sarah's fever broke, he said, setting 1 cup beside her. She took feed this evening. God is good, Ruth replied softly. Ephraim nodded once, then turned to leave. At the door, he paused. The song, he said, not looking back. If you'd like to sing it again sometime, I wouldn't mind. Ruth smiled at her letter, hearing what he couldn't quite say. I'd like that very much. She watched him walk away, his footsteps echoing in the quiet house. Outside, the last rays of sun caught the snow, turning the world to diamond dust. Spring felt closer somehow, despite the cold. The first warm breeze of spring swept through the valley, carrying the scent of thawing earth. Ruth stood at the cabin door, watching a wagon approach through the morning mist. The sound of wooden wheels crunching on the muddy path broke the familiar quiet of their homestead. Ephraim, she called toward the barn. Company's coming. The wagon carried Mr. Peterson, their usual supply trader, but today he wasn't alone. Beside him sat a well-dressed gentleman whose polished appearance seemed out of place against the rugged landscape. Ruth noticed Ephraim's shoulders tighten as he emerged from the barn, wiping his hands on his work clothes. "Morning, folks," Mr. Peterson called out, pulling the wagon to a stop. "Brought your spring supplies. And this here's Mr. Albert Thorne from the railroad company. Says he's got business to discuss." Mr. Thorne stepped down from the wagon, his boots unmarked by dust or mud. "Mrs. Stoll, Mr. Stoll," he said, tipping his hat. His smile didn't reach his eyes. "I represent the Western Pacific Railroad Company. We're finalizing our survey of the new line through the valley." Ruth felt Ephraim move closer to her side. "We want no part of your railroad," he said firmly. Thorne's smile widened. "I'm afraid it's not that simple." He pulled several folded papers from his leather satchel. "The new survey shows the line cutting through your south pasture. Most beneficial route for all concerned." "I have the deed to this land," Ephraim stated, his voice hard. "Been here 8 years. Your line can go elsewhere." "Ah, yes. The deed." Thorne unfolded one of the papers with careful precision. "That's precisely what I've come to discuss. You see, according to county records, this property isn't in your name at all, Mr. Stoll." Ruth felt the air grow thick with tension. Ephraim's face had gone pale. "The deed," Thorne continued, "is recorded in the name of Ruth Yoder Stoll. Quite interesting, really. Your late wife had it changed years ago, though I can't imagine why." The words hit Ruth like a physical blow. She swayed slightly, grateful for the door frame behind her. "There must be some mistake," she whispered. "No mistake, madam." Thorne held out the document. "Your name, clear as day. Elizabeth Stoll had it recorded thus before her passing. Makes our negotiations much simpler, really." Ephraim snatched the paper, his hands shaking as he read. Ruth watched his face darken with anger and disbelief. "We'll be making generous offers for the right-of-way," Thorne said smoothly. "Though, of course, if we can't reach an agreement, there are other methods. Eminent domain can be unpleasant." He replaced his hat with deliberate care. "I'll return next week to begin proper negotiations. Good day to you both." Mr. Peterson, who had been unloading supplies with uncomfortable silence, quickly finished his work. The wagon soon disappeared into the distance, leaving Ruth and Ephraim alone with the devastating news. "Ephraim," Ruth began, her voice trembling, "I didn't know—" He whirled to face her, his eyes blazing. "Did you plan this? Was this why you agreed to the marriage so easily?" "No." Tears spilled down Ruth's cheeks. "How could you think that? I knew nothing about any deed." 8 years of work," he growled. 8 years building this place, and now it's all in your hands? Elizabeth would never—" His voice broke. Without another word, he strode to the barn and emerged moments later on horseback, spurring the animal hard toward the western ridge. Ruth sank to the porch steps, her legs too weak to hold her. The spring breeze that had seemed so promising now felt cold against her wet cheeks. She sat there as the sun crossed the sky, unable to move, unable to think beyond the hurt in Ephraim's eyes. Midnight found her still awake, tending the dying fire. The door creaked open, and Ephraim's heavy steps crossed the wooden floor. He smelled of horses and night air. Without speaking, he moved to the hearth and added wood to the embers, bringing the flames back to life. Finally, still facing the fire, he whispered, "I don't blame you." Ruth watched his broad back, seeing the exhaustion in the slope of his shoulders. The flames cast dancing shadows on the cabin walls, reminiscent of their first night together, when he had promised her safety. Now that promise lay as fragile as ash between them. They sat in uneasy silence as the fire slowly died once more, neither finding words to bridge the chasm that had opened between them. Outside, the first birds began their dawn chorus, greeting another day neither of them was ready to face. The days following Thorne's visit stretched like cold molasses. Ruth rose each morning before dawn, determined to prove her worth through work. She followed Ephraim to the barn without invitation, grabbing a milk pail before he could object. "I can manage," he said gruffly on the first morning. "I know you can," Ruth replied, keeping her voice steady. "But 4 hands work better than 2. He didn't argue, and soon they fell into a rhythm, him feeding the animals while she milked, both moving in careful orbits that rarely crossed. The silence between them had changed from peaceful to brittle, like ice over a deep stream. On the 4th morning, Ruth heard hoofbeats approaching as she hung laundry. Josiah Red Elk appeared around the bend, his horse's breath steaming in the cool air. He carried a leather mail pouch and drew his mount to a stop at a respectful distance. "Morning, Mrs. Stoll," he called softly. "Brought your letters and some news from town." Ruth glanced toward the barn where Ephraim worked, then walked to meet Josiah. "Thank you kindly," she said, accepting the small bundle of mail. Josiah's dark eyes held concern. "Railroad's calling a meeting," he said. "Tomorrow afternoon at the town hall. All local farmers invited to discuss the new line." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "Might be worth hearing what they're offering." "I'll tell him," Ruth promised, though she already knew Ephraim's answer. Sure enough, that evening over supper, Ephraim's response was swift and final. "No," he said, pushing away his half-eaten stew. "Won't waste breath listening to their lies." Ruth watched him stride from the table, his boots heavy on the floorboards. In the quiet that followed, she made her decision. The next morning, she rose earlier than usual. She had never driven the wagon alone, but she'd watched Ephraim enough times. The roads were treacherous with patches of spring mud and lingering ice, but Ruth guided the horses carefully, reciting psalms to steady her nerves. The town hall was crowded with farmers and ranchers, their worried faces reflecting her own concerns. Ruth slipped into a back row, grateful when Mrs. Peterson, the trader's wife, smiled and shifted to make room. Mr. Thorne stood at the front, his voice smooth as he explained the railroad's plans. Maps covered the walls, showing the proposed route slicing through familiar lands like a knife wound. When he spoke of compensation, Ruth leaned forward, straining to understand the legal terms. "Property rights must be clearly established," Thorne emphasized, his gaze sweeping the room. "Any disputed ownership could result in complications." Ruth's hands tightened in her lap. She understood the threat beneath his polite words. After the meeting, she gathered every pamphlet and document available, tucking them carefully in her shawl. The sun was setting by the time she guided the wagon home. Ephraim stood in the doorway, his face dark with worry and anger. "Where have you been?" he demanded as she climbed down. Ruth straightened her back, meeting his gaze. "The railroad meeting," she said clearly. "Since this land bears my name, I needed to understand." She expected him to shout, but his voice came quiet and dangerous. "You had no right." "No?" Ruth felt something rise in her chest, not anger, but certainty. "If God placed this land in my name, perhaps he meant me to guard it." She took a breath, steadying herself. "The railroad will come, whether we wish it or not. But there are ways to protect what matters, if we work together." Ephraim stared at her for a long moment, then turned and walked away. Ruth's shoulders slumped as she unhitched the horses alone, fighting back tears of frustration. That night, as she tried to sleep, she heard sounds from outside her room, the familiar rasp of sandpaper on wood, the tap of hammer on nails. The drafty window that had rattled since her arrival fell silent. In the morning, Ruth found fresh sawdust on the floor, and the window fitted snug in its frame. Ephraim had already gone to the barn, but his message was clear in the careful craftsmanship, an apology he couldn't speak aloud. She touched the smooth wood, feeling the warmth of morning sun through the now steady pane. Perhaps, like this window, broken things could be mended with patience and careful hands. Ruth squared her shoulders and headed to the barn. There were chores to be done, and she intended to do her share. May brought the first true warmth to the valley, painting the hills in tender green. But with the spring rains came sickness. Ruth was hanging sheets to dry when she heard the urgent hoofbeats approaching. Sarah Jensen, her face flushed from riding, pulled her horse to a stop by the fence. "Mrs. Stoll," she called, voice trembling. "My Clara's taken bad with fever. Been 3 days now and nothing helps. Would you—" She twisted her hands in her skirts. "Folks say you have a way with the sick." Ruth's heart clenched at the fear in the woman's eyes. "Let me speak to my husband," she said, already moving toward the barn where Ephraim worked. He looked up from mending a bridle as she explained. His jaw tightened. "Storm's coming," he said, nodding toward the darkening sky. "Too dangerous." "She's 7 years old, Ephraim." Ruth kept her voice gentle but firm. "The same age as—" She stopped, seeing him flinch. After a long moment, he spoke quietly. "Take the bay mare. She's sure-footed." Ruth gathered her medicines, willow bark for fever, yarrow for sweating, honey for cough, and rode out with Sarah. The rain started before they were halfway there, soaking through their shawls. By the time they reached the Jensen's cabin, thunder was rolling across the valley. Inside, Clara lay burning on her small bed, her blonde hair dark with sweat. Ruth touched the child's forehead and fought to keep her expression calm. "Fetch fresh water," she told Sarah. "As much as you can carry. And clean rags." Through the afternoon and into the night, Ruth bathed Clara's hot skin with cool cloths, spooned willow tea between her cracked lips, and sang soft hymns when the fever dreams made her whimper. She dozed in a hard chair between tasks, her back aching, but never left the child's side. The second night, as rain drummed on the roof, Ruth heard heavy boots on the porch. Ephraim stepped into the lamplight, water dripping from his hat. Without a word, he set down a basket of fresh eggs and bread, then began hauling water from the well. Hours blurred together. Ruth's voice grew hoarse from singing, but Clara seemed calmer when she heard the gentle hymns. Ephraim appeared regularly with water and firewood, his presence steady as a heartbeat. Near dawn on the third day, Clara's fever broke. Ruth almost wept when the child opened clear eyes and asked for water. Sarah did cry, gathering her daughter close. "God sent you both," she whispered to Ruth and Ephraim. "We won't forget this kindness." The ride home was silent, their horses picking carefully through mud puddles. Ruth swayed with exhaustion in the saddle. At their gate, Ephraim finally spoke. "You reminded me," he said slowly, as if the words were difficult. "What mercy feels like." He paused, then added even more quietly, "I'd forgotten." Ruth's throat tightened. "We all need reminding sometimes." Inside, she tried to make supper, but fatigue made her clumsy. The bread came out burnt, and she nearly dropped it trying to save it. To her surprise, Ephraim chuckled. A rusty sound, as if long unused. "Reckon we won't starve," he said, breaking off a charred piece. His eyes held a warmth she'd never seen before. Ruth found herself laughing, too. The sound strange but welcome in the usually quiet kitchen. They ate the burned bread with good butter, and for the first time, the meal felt like more than just sustenance. That night, as Ruth readied for bed, she noticed something different about the house. The walls seemed to hold heat better. The shadows felt less heavy. Like a person taking their first deep breath after long illness, the home itself seemed to be awakening. In her room, Ruth heard Ephraim moving about the kitchen, his footsteps no longer quite so leaden. The sound of him humming drifted up, barely audible, slightly off-key, but unmistakably a hymn. She smiled in the darkness, her heart full of quiet joy. They had saved more than just Clara's life in those long nights of vigil. Something else had been healed, something that had been frozen and hurting in both of them. Ruth closed her eyes, grateful for the mystery of God's timing, for the way mercy given freely often returns, multiplied. Outside her window, spring peepers sang their evening chorus, and the last light faded from a rain-washed sky. The house creaked gently, settling into night, no longer a shelter of grief, but slowly becoming a home. June painted the valley in shades of gold and green. Ruth stood at the edge of their property, watching clouds drift over distant peaks. The morning sun warmed her face as she gathered wild roses for the kitchen table. A movement caught her eye, Josiah Red Elk leading his horse along the valley's rim. He raised a hand in greeting, and Ruth nodded back, remembering Ephraim's warning about strangers. But something in Josiah's steady presence made her pause, rather than turn away. "Good morning, Mrs. Stoll," he said, keeping a respectful distance. "The roses are early this year." "They are," Ruth agreed, then hesitated before adding, "My husband is concerned about the railroad's plans." Josiah's expression grew thoughtful. "As he should be. But there's something you both should know about this land." He gestured toward a shallow depression running across their pasture. "Would you walk with me? I have something to show you." Ruth glanced toward the house, then decided. Yes, but not far. They followed what looked like a natural crease in the earth, but as they walked, Josiah pointed out subtle signs, arranged stones, carefully graded slopes. "This was built by my grandfather's people," he explained, "an irrigation ditch that once brought water to many families." Ruth touched one of the weathered stones. "I had no thought there was such history here." "Most settlers don't see it," Josiah said without bitterness, "but the water remembers. Even now during heavy rains it tries to follow its old path." He knelt and sifted soil through his fingers. "My people believe land isn't something to be owned, but borrowed from our children's children. We're caretakers, not masters." Ruth thought of her Bible's teachings about stewardship. "Like being given charge of God's garden." "Yes." Josiah smiled. "The railroad men see only empty space to claim. They don't understand that every stream has a story. Every hill holds memories." Looking across their farm with new eyes, Ruth saw how the old ditch curved naturally with the land's contours. "Part of our best pasture depends on this water," she realized aloud. "We've been using your grandfather's wisdom without knowing it." "Water knows no boundaries," Josiah said. "It belongs to all or none." He straightened, brushing dirt from his hands. "Whatever you decide about the railroad's offers, remember, this land has always been shared." Ruth walked back slowly, her arms full of roses but her mind fuller still. When she reached the house, she found Ephraim mending a fence nearby. She took a deep breath and told him everything, about meeting Josiah, the ancient irrigation ditch, and the idea of land as sacred trust. Ephraim's face tightened at first, but he listened without interrupting. When she finished, he stood silent for a long moment, looking out over their fields. "My father taught me a man's land is his castle," he said finally. "But perhaps—" He paused, struggling. "Perhaps there's wisdom in other ways too." Ruth touched his arm gently. "We can honor both, your father's teaching about caring for what's ours, and the truth that all earth is God's first." Something shifted in Ephraim's expression. Without speaking, He led her to a sunny patch beside the barn, about 20 feet square. "Been meaning to show you this," he said. "Good soil here. Thought maybe, if you wanted your own garden plot." Ruth's heart swelled at what this offering meant. Her first real authority on the farm, a space that was truly hers to tend. Together they worked the soil, Ephraim's strong hands breaking up the heavier clods while Ruth cleared stones. They planted neat rows of lettuce and beans, their fingers meeting in the dark earth. As they worked, Ruth hummed an old planting song her mother had taught her. After a while, she noticed Ephraim's movements falling into rhythm with the tune. The sun warm on their backs, the soil rich with promise beneath their hands. It felt like a kind of prayer. When they finished, Ruth stood looking at their morning's work. The garden wasn't large, but it represented something profound: trust, partnership, and a new way of seeing their place in this valley. She remembered Josiah's words about water knowing no boundaries and felt a deep certainty that they were part of something larger than themselves. Ephraim brushed soil from his pants and squinted at the sky. "Rain coming tomorrow," he said. "Good timing for new seeds." He paused, then added quietly, "You did right, listening to the Ute man's story. Reckon we all have something to learn about this land." Ruth smiled, touching one of the small markers they'd placed to guide the rows. In her heart, she offered up a promise: to the soil, to the ancient waters running beneath, and to whatever future God had planned for this valley, that she would be a faithful steward of all she'd been given. July brought merciless heat to the San Luis Valley. The sun beat down on the farmland like a hammer on hot iron, making the air shimmer above the fields. Ruth wiped sweat from her brow as she inspected her wilting garden, her heart aching for the struggling plants. For 3 days, she watched her precious vegetables droop lower despite her careful morning watering. The lettuce leaves curled inward, and the bean stalks sagged against their supports. She'd tried rigging canvas sheets for shade, but the harsh Colorado sun found every gap. On the 4th morning, Ruth woke to the sound of hammering. She dressed quickly and stepped onto the porch, squinting in the early light. There stood Ephraim, methodically constructing something near her garden plot. Wooden boards from an old wagon lay scattered around him, along with a stack of glass panes she recognized from the abandoned Peterson place down the valley. "Ephraim?" she called softly, not wanting to startle him. He looked up, a faint smile touching his usually stern face. "Thought you might be needing this," he said, gesturing to his work. "Greenhouse, for your plants." Ruth walked closer, amazed at the simple but sturdy frame taking shape. Ephraim had already set 4 corner posts and was fitting crossbeams between them. The glass panes waited nearby, ready to catch and hold the sun's warmth while protecting what grew beneath. She watched him work through the morning, his movements sure and practiced. By midday, the basic structure stood complete. Ephraim wiped his brow and stepped back, studying his handiwork. "Should help with the heat now," he said. "And come winter." He paused, looking at her directly. "You deserve color even in winter." Ruth's heart swelled at his words. Without thinking, she reached out and touched his arm in gratitude. To her surprise, he didn't pull away. Instead, he covered her hand briefly with his own, rough with calluses but gentle in its touch. That evening, as purple dusk settled over the valley, Ephraim brought 2 cups of coffee to the porch. Ruth accepted hers with quiet thanks, and together they sat watching stars appear in the darkening sky. The night air cooled their sun-warmed skin as crickets began their evening chorus. "Been meaning to tell you something," Ephraim said finally, his voice low and uncertain. He stared into his coffee cup as if reading words there. About Sarah, my first wife, and little Samuel? Ruth held her breath, waiting. This was the first time he'd spoken their names. The fever came fast, he continued. I was in town, trading. Should have been home. By the time I returned, his voice caught. I'd promised to protect them. Failed in that. Reckoned God was punishing me, so He swallowed hard. I closed up everything. My house, my heart, my faith. Ruth listened, her own heart aching for his pain. When he fell silent, she spoke softly. Ephraim, forgiveness isn't earned. It's given. Like grace. She gazed up at the star-filled sky. God keeps that door unlocked, always. How can you be so sure? He whispered. Because he promises it, she replied simply. Would you pray with me? For a long moment, Ephraim sat motionless. Then, slowly, he reached for her hand. Together they bowed their heads in the starlight. Ruth's gentle voice carried their shared prayer into the night air, asking for healing, for peace, for the courage to trust love again. Halfway through, Ephraim's shoulders began to shake. Silent tears fell, years of pent-up grief finally finding release. Ruth kept holding his hand, her quiet prayers surrounding him like a shelter. The next morning dawned clear and hot. Ruth woke early to find Ephraim already gone to town for trading day. She spent the morning transplanting her struggling vegetables into the new greenhouse, singing hymns as she worked. Around noon, Martha Weber from town came by with eggs to trade. Her eyes were wide with news. You'll never believe what I saw in the market square, she said. Your Ephraim smiling, actually smiling while trading with young Tim Baker. First time I've seen that in 2 years, I reckon. Ruth smiled, thinking of the greenhouse standing proud beside their garden. The Lord works in mysterious ways, she said simply, and traded Martha extra beans for her eggs. Inside the greenhouse, the plants already stood straighter, protected from the harsh wind and burning sun. Ruth touched one of the glass panes, still cool from the morning air. Like the greenhouse sheltered her garden, she thought. Love could shelter a heart, letting light in while keeping the harsh weather at bay. Outside, a meadowlark trilled its bright song into the summer air. Ruth hummed along as she worked, her heart full of gratitude for unlocked doors and answered prayers. The golden days of late August brought a harsh ending to summer's peace. Ruth stood at the kitchen window, washing dishes from their evening meal, when she spotted 3 men riding up the dusty path to their farm. Their fine clothes and determined expressions made her stomach clench with worry. Ephraim, she called softly. He looked up from his Bible, noticed her concern, and moved to the door. The men dismounted, dust coating their polished boots. The tallest one, wearing a railroad company badge, stepped forward. Mr. Stoll, we're here on behalf of the Denver and Rio Grande Western. You have 1 week to vacate this property. Ephraim stood straighter, his voice firm. This is my home. I won't leave. The company has legal right to this land for the new line. The foreman thrust papers toward him. 1 week, or we'll remove you ourselves. Get off my property, Ephraim said quietly, not touching the papers. The men mounted up, the leader pausing to say, Don't be foolish, Stoll. Some fights can't be won. Ruth watched them ride away, her heart pounding. Ephraim spent the evening checking locks and loading his old rifle, though she knew he'd never use it. They went to bed uneasy, prayer heavy on their lips. Deep in the night, Ruth woke to the acrid smell of smoke. Orange light flickered through their window. She bolted upright. Ephraim, fire! He was already moving, pulling on boots. Ruth followed him to the porch and froze in horror. The barn blazed against the black sky, flames reaching up like desperate fingers. Dark figures moved in the firelight, holding torches. "No!" Ephraim shouted, racing toward them. Ruth saw 3 men scatter, but one turned to face Ephraim. There was a brief, violent struggle. Ephraim, stronger from years of farm work, pinned the man down just as hoofbeats thundered up the road. Sheriff Miller arrived with 2 deputies, their badges catching the firelight. But instead of pursuing the fleeing arsonists, they moved toward Ephraim. "Release that man, Stoll," the sheriff ordered, drawing his pistol. "He tried to burn down my barn," Ephraim protested, keeping his grip on the struggling man. "Let him go, now!" The sheriff's voice was cold. "You're under arrest for assault." "This is madness!" Ruth ran forward, clutching the property deed she'd grabbed from inside. "This farm is in my name. These men are the criminals." Sheriff Miller barely glanced at the paper. "Ma'am, under married woman law, your property became your husband's at marriage, and that deed ain't worth the paper it's written on now. The railroad's claim supersedes it." Ruth watched helplessly as they handcuffed Ephraim. The man he'd caught slipped away into the darkness, leaving only the smell of coal oil on the night air. The barn continued to burn despite her neighbor's arrival with buckets to help fight the fire. "Ruth," Ephraim called, as they led him to the sheriff's horse. "Stay strong. Truth will prevail." But his eyes held fear she'd never seen before. Ruth stood rooted, watching them ride away with her husband. Around her, the fire's heat pushed back the night, consuming the barn where they'd stored their winter hay. The greenhouse glass shattered in the heat, and her carefully tended plants withered in the inferno. She barely noticed the neighbors working to keep the flames from spreading to the house. Their voices seemed to come from far away as she stared at the destruction of everything they'd built together. As false dawn began to pale the sky, Ruth knelt in the cooling ashes. Her fingers found Ephraim's worn hat, dropped in the struggle. Soot streaked her dress and face as she clutched it to her chest. The barn was nothing but smoldering timbers now, the greenhouse a skeleton of blackened wood and broken glass. "The Lord gives, and the Lord takes away," she whispered, remembering the Bible verse. But this wasn't God's doing. This was men's greed and corruption twisting the law to serve their purposes. Martha Weber touched her shoulder gently. "Come inside, Ruth. You need rest." But Ruth shook her head. Looking at the ruins of their farm, she felt something steel itself inside her. They'd taken her husband, threatened her home, and destroyed their livelihood. But they hadn't broken her spirit. "I won't let this stand," she said, her voice growing stronger. "This isn't justice, and I won't let it prevail." The rising sun painted the smoke-filled sky in shades of amber and gray. Ruth stood, still holding Ephraim's hat, and faced the dawn. She had lost everything she and Ephraim had rebuilt together. But she had not lost her faith, nor her determination to fight for what was right. Around her, the ashes of their barn slowly cooled in the morning air. But the fire of purpose in Ruth's heart was just beginning to burn. The October wind whistled through the broken greenhouse, carrying winter's first chill. Ruth wrapped her shawl tighter and surveyed the farm's wounds. The barn's charred bones still stood, a stark reminder of that terrible night. But she refused to let despair take root. Each morning, she rose before dawn to tend what remained of their livestock in the makeshift shelter she'd built from salvaged boards. The goats and 2 surviving horses huddled there, their breath making clouds in the cold air. Ruth mucked stalls and distributed feed, remembering how she and Ephraim had worked side by side just weeks ago. Josiah Red Elk appeared every day as the sun crested the mountains, leading his horse laden with tools and supplies. His quiet strength and steady hands helped rebuild fences, patch roofing, and shore up walls against approaching winter. "You have friends here, Ruth," he said one morning, showing her how to properly splice fence wire. "More than you know." She nodded, grateful for his presence. "I pray the judge will see truth clearly." "The law can bend toward justice when good people stand firm," Josiah replied, his dark eyes kind. "Have you written to Circuit Judge Hardin yet?" That evening, Ruth sat at the kitchen table, carefully drafting her letter by lamplight. She included copies of the original deed, marriage certificate, and witness statements about the barn burning. Her hand trembled slightly as she sealed the envelope, knowing how much rested on these papers. The next day, she rode into town to send the documents by stagecoach to Pueblo. The postmaster promised to mark it urgent, but warned winter storms might delay mail. Ruth thanked him and avoided looking toward the jail where Ephraim waited. Weeks crept past like molasses in December. Ruth established new routines to keep hope alive. Every evening she lit the lamps and read aloud from Ephraim's Bible, her voice filling the cabin's emptiness. His chair stayed in its place by the hearth, waiting. Sometimes she imagined she could hear him humming hymns from his cell in town. Josiah brought news when he could. "The railroad men watch the property," he warned one afternoon, "but they won't move until after the trial. They need legal backing first." Ruth nodded, checking the root cellar's dwindling supplies. "Then we wait on the judge's reply." The waiting ended on a bitter, cold Tuesday evening. Ruth had just finished evening prayers when sharp knocking startled her. She opened the door to find young Tommy Weber, the telegraph operator's son, clutching a yellow paper. "Pa said to bring this straight away, Mrs. Stoll," he panted, having run all the way from town. Ruth's fingers shook as she unfolded the telegram. The words jumped out at her. Trial date moved forward. Stop heavy snow predicted. Stop court. Convenes this Friday. Stop presence required. Stop Judge Benjamin Hardin 3 days. Her heart raced. The journey to Pueblo usually took 2 days in good weather. With snow threatening, she'd need to leave at first light. Ruth spent the night preparing. She packed her warmest clothes, remaining food, and all the legal documents. In the pre-dawn darkness, she knelt by Ephraim's chair. "Lord," she whispered, "grant me strength to face what comes. Let truth prevail." The eastern sky was just beginning to pale when Josiah arrived, leading a sturdy mountain pony already saddled. "The livery stable owner insisted," he explained. "Said to tell you it's payment for nursing his daughter Clara through the fever." Tears pricked Ruth's eyes at this kindness. "Will you watch over things here?" she asked. Josiah nodded solemnly. "I'll keep the animals fed and the pipes from freezing. Go with courage, Ruth. The judge is a fair man." Ruth mounted carefully, settling her skirts. The borrowed pony shifted beneath her, eager to move. She took one last look at the cabin, their home, despite everything, before turning toward the road to Pueblo. "Thank you, Josiah," she said softly, "for everything." He raised his hand in farewell. "May the Creator guide your path." Ruth nudged the pony forward, her back straight despite the weight of responsibility on her shoulders. The morning air bit at her cheeks as she rode east, toward whatever justice awaited. She was no longer the timid girl who had arrived in a wagon months ago, bound by others' choices. Now she chose her own path, guided by faith and determination. The sun rose fully as she crested the first hill, painting the valley in shades of amber and rose. Somewhere ahead lay Pueblo, the courthouse, and the chance to make things right. Ruth touched the pocket holding their precious documents and urged the pony to a steady trot. 3 days to reach the trial that would decide everything. Behind her, Josiah watched until she disappeared from view. He turned to begin his daily tasks. knowing Ruth carried not just papers and provisions, but the prayers of all who had witnessed her quiet courage grow in the face of adversity. The snow began falling as Ruth and Josiah loaded the last supplies into his wagon. Thick white flakes swirled around them, already coating the ground in a treacherous blanket. Ruth clutched her woolen shawl tighter as Josiah clicked to the horses. "We should make the mission church by nightfall," he said, his breath visible in the cold air. "If we push hard." The wagon creaked as they set out, wheels crunching through fresh snow. Ruth sat beside Josiah on the driver's bench, her documents secured in oilcloth beneath her skirts. The familiar landscape disappeared behind curtains of white as the storm intensified. By midday, the horses struggled against mounting drifts. Wind cut through their clothes like knives of ice. Ruth's fingers grew numb despite her thick mittens. Beside her, Josiah hunched forward, his shoulders tense with cold and concentration. "There," he called over the wind's howl, pointing to a dim shape ahead. "The mission spire." The small church emerged from the whiteout like an answer to prayer. Its windows glowed with welcoming lamplight. As they pulled up to the hitching post, the door opened, spilling golden light onto the snow. Reverend Matthews hurried out to help them. "Praise be, you've made it," he said, leading them inside. "I've been watching the road since the storm hit." The church's single room was warm from a pot-bellied stove. Ruth sank gratefully onto a wooden pew, while Josiah and the Reverend tended to the horses. When they returned, stamping snow from their boots, Reverend Matthew's wife brought them steaming bowls of stew. "You'll stay the night," she insisted. "No arguing." Later, as Ruth prepared her bedroll near the stove, Reverend Matthews approached with his Bible. "The Lord placed something on my heart for you," he said, opening to the Psalms. "Here, He will make your righteousness shine like the dawn, the justice of your cause like the noonday sun." Ruth traced the words with trembling fingers. "Thank you," she whispered. "I needed this reminder." Dawn brought no relief from the storm. If anything, the snow fell harder as they set out again. Josiah's hands were white-knuckled on the reins as the horses plowed forward. Ruth prayed silently, watching the road vanish and reappear with each gust. By afternoon, the situation grew desperate. The horses stumbled in deep drifts, their strength failing. Josiah swayed in his seat, his face gray with exhaustion. Without warning, he slumped forward. "Josiah!" Ruth grabbed him before he could fall. His skin felt like ice. She knew what she had to do. Taking the reins, Ruth helped Josiah into the wagon bed where he could shelter under blankets. Her hands shook as she clicked to the horses, but her voice was steady as she began to pray aloud. "Lord, guide us through this valley of shadow," she called into the wind. "Light our path as you promised. Show us the way to safety." Hour after hour, Ruth drove on. Her prayers never ceased, even as darkness fell. The horses pushed forward, step by struggling step. Just when despair threatened to overwhelm her, dim lights appeared in the distance. "Pueblo," she breathed. "Thank you, Lord. Thank you." The town's lanterns guided them in like beacons. Ruth's arms ached as she finally drew the wagon to a stop outside the livery stable. People rushed out to help, drawn by the commotion of their arrival. "Get these horses warm," someone shouted, "and fetch the doctor for this man." Ruth stumbled down from the wagon, her legs nearly giving way. As willing hands helped Josiah toward the doctor's office, she looked up at the jail's second story. There, in a window, she saw a familiar silhouette, Ephraim, watching. Their eyes met across the snowy street. He couldn't know why she'd come, couldn't understand yet what she'd risked to reach him. But something in his stance told her he saw the change in her. She was no longer the frightened bride who'd arrived at his farm months ago. Faith and hardship had forged her into something stronger. Ruth squared her shoulders, despite her exhaustion. Tomorrow would bring the trial, but tonight she had won a different victory. She had faced the storm and found her own courage, guided by the light of truth and justice. As she turned toward the boarding house, snow settling like a blessing in her hair, she whispered one final prayer of gratitude. Behind her, Ephraim's shadow remained at the window, watching until she disappeared into the gathering dark. The courthouse hummed with tension as Ruth stood before Judge Hardin. Morning light streamed through tall windows, casting long shadows across the worn floorboards. Thorne and his 2 railroad lawyers sat smugly at their table, papers spread before them like a deck of cards in a rigged game. "Your Honor," Thorne's lawyer declared, rising with practiced grace, "the deed cannot stand. Under married woman's property law, all holdings transfer to the husband upon marriage. The document is void." Ruth's hands trembled as she clutched her Bible, but her voice rang clear. "If it please the court, I have evidence to present." From within the Bible's pages, she withdrew 2 yellowed papers. The first was her marriage contract, signed in her uncle's cramped hand with the telling words, "Under protest," scrawled beneath his name. The second, found tucked in an old hymnal back at the farm, made tears spring to her eyes as she read it aloud. "To the woman who comes after me, this land is yours if you bring him back to the Lord." The late Mrs. Stoll's final testament, written in fading ink. Judge Hardin leaned forward, his stern face softening as he studied the documents. His eyes drifted to where Josiah sat in the gallery, and something passed between them. A shared memory of Josiah's father, whose integrity had once helped forge peace in these valleys. "Mr. Thorne," the judge's voice filled the chamber, "your company's actions, the arson, the false arrest, show contempt for both law and decency. This court finds the deed valid as recorded. Furthermore, damages of $500 are awarded to Mrs. Ruth Stoll, and her husband is to be released immediately." The gavel struck like thunder. Ruth stood frozen, scarcely breathing, until movement near the door caught her eye. Ephraim was already crossing the courtroom toward her, his weathered face streaked with tears. He reached for her with trembling hands. "Ruth," he whispered, drawing her close. "My Ruth." She melted into his embrace as snowlight filtered through the courthouse windows, turning the dust motes to dancing stars around them. In that moment, she felt the truth of God's promise, justice shining like the noonday sun, healing what had been broken, restoring what was lost. Late March brought the first whispers of thaw to the San Luis Valley. Melting snow dripped from pine boughs and trickled down the mountainsides in silvery streams. At the Stoll farm, hope flowed just as freely. Ruth and Ephraim stood hand in hand, watching as neighbors raised the framework of their new barn. The sound of hammers rang across the valley like bells of celebration. Men from 3 counties had come, Mennonite, Amish, and townsfolk alike, bringing lumber, nails, and willing hearts. "Never seen such a gathering," Josiah Red Elk remarked, helping to guide a heavy beam into place. His cousins worked alongside, showing the others their people's methods for securing posts against mountain winds. The old boundaries between communities dissolved like spring snow in sunshine. Inside the cabin, Ruth kneaded bread while 2 orphaned sisters, Emma and Sarah Miller, helped roll out pie crust. Their parents had been lost to fever that winter, and Ruth had opened her door without hesitation. Now their laughter brightened the once silent rooms. "Miss Ruth," 8-year-old Emma called, "can we sing while we bake?" Ruth smiled, remembering darker days when music was forbidden. "Of course, dear one." As April turned to May, the fertile soil awakened. Ruth and Ephraim worked side by side, planting rows of corn and beans. They expanded the irrigation channels, sharing water with neighboring farms as Josiah had taught them. The ancient ditches, restored with respect, brought life to all. "The land knows no boundaries," Josiah had said, showing them how to direct the flow. Like God's love, it gives freely to all who tend it with care. One evening in early June, as sunset painted the mountains rose gold, the community gathered beneath the towering pines near the house. Snow still capped the distant peaks, but here below, wildflowers dotted the grass. Preacher Matthews stood before them, his weathered Bible open in his hands. Ruth wore a simple blue dress, her hair crowned with mountain columbine. Ephraim's eyes shone as he took her hands in his. This time, no duty or debt brought them together. Only love, freely chosen. "I once was cold," Ephraim's voice carried clear and strong, "but she thawed me with her grace." Tears glimmered in his eyes as he spoke his vows. "God sent me not just a wife, but redemption wearing her face." Ruth's heart soared as she began to sing, her voice rising pure and true. "Rock of ages, cleft for me, let me hide myself in thee." One by one, others joined in. The orphan girls, the neighbors, even Josiah adding his deep bass to the harmony. The hymn echoed off the mountainsides like a prayer. Travelers passing through the valley soon spread word of the Stoll farm, a place where fences served only to keep cattle, not people, apart. Where Ute and settler, orphan and elder found welcome. Where the aroma of fresh bread and the sound of hymns floated on the evening breeze. The cold Amish man was cold no more, they said. His wife's warmth had melted years of winter, and now their home bloomed like a garden of mercy under the Colorado sky. Thank you for being here. If something in this story stayed with you, I'd love to see you again. Subscribe. And tomorrow, I'll bring you another story crafted with heart.